Left stranded in the snowdrifts when her husband rode away on their only horse, she learned that the deadly silence strikes faster than the freezing temperatures. Crying was pointless when tears turned to ice, so she shut her eyes and awaited her fate. Suddenly, the sharp aroma of pine cut through the frosty air, accompanied by the heavy crunch of approaching boots. The wind pouring down from the jagged peaks didn't howl, it screamed. It was a physical thing, a solid wall of freezing air that battered the splintered wood of the wagon. Lana sat against the rear wheel. Her knees were pulled tight to her chest, her arms wrapped around them in a useless attempt to trap whatever heat was left in her body. The snow had already drifted up to her waist. It felt heavy, like lead blankets. "I'll fetch help from the fort," Josiah had said. He hadn't looked her in the eye. That was the detail that kept turning over in her sluggish mind. He had looked at the horizon, at the dead oxen, at his own gloved hands, but not at her. He had taken the thickest wool blanket. He had taken the rifle. He had taken the bay gelding, the only animal that hadn't succumbed to the bitter freeze of the pass. He had left her a tin cup, a half-empty canteen that was now a solid block of ice, and a promise that tasted like ash the moment it left his mouth. That was yesterday, or maybe the day before. Time had lost its shape. At first, the cold was an agony. It bit into her fingers and toes like rusted nails. She had shivered so violently her teeth chipped. She had paced the small patch of packed snow behind the wagon, screaming at the wind, screaming at Josiah, screaming at a God she was rapidly ceasing to believe in. But the body only fights for so long. Eventually, it realizes the war is lost. The shivering stopped a few hours ago. That was the bad sign. She remembered her father telling her that, back in Ohio, a lifetime ago. "When you stop shaking, Lana, that's the frost taking hold of your blood." Now, there was only a profound, heavy lethargy. The sharp stabbing in her extremities had faded into a dull, wooden numbness. She couldn't feel her feet. She couldn't wiggle her toes. When she looked down, she saw her hands resting in her lap, but they didn't feel like her hands. The skin was a pale, sickly blue, the knuckles stark white. The wind died down for a fraction of a second, and in that pause, the silence of the mountains rushed in. It was absolute. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the vast, suffocating silence of a world buried in white. Lana let her head fall back against the wooden spokes of the wheel. The iron rim bit into her scalp through her thin bonnet, but she barely felt it. She was so tired. Her eyelids felt like they were weighted with stones. A strange, deceptive warmth began to bloom in her chest. It was a lying heat, a phantom comfort. She knew it meant the end was near, but she didn't care anymore. The panic had burned itself out. The anger at Josiah had frozen solid. All that was left was the bone-deep desire to sleep. She let her eyes slide shut. The darkness was a relief from the blinding glare of the snow. Just a few minutes, she thought. Just a little rest. The hallucination started shortly after. She heard a crunching sound, rhythmic, heavy. The sound of boots breaking through crusty snow. She ignored it. The dying mind played cruel tricks, but the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, closer. Then a shadow fell over her. Even with her eyes closed, she could sense the blocking of the weak, filtered sunlight. Lana forced her eyes open. Her eyelashes were frozen together, and it took a monumental effort to pry them apart. Through a blurred, watery gaze, she saw a massive shape looming over her. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a man. He was huge, broad-shouldered and imposing, wrapped in furs and thick, greasy leather. A heavy beard covered his jaw, frosted with ice. His face was a map of deep lines and weathered skin, pulled taut against the biting cold. He carried a long rifle in one hand, resting it casually against his shoulder. He stood there for a long moment, looking down at her. His eyes were the color of slate, hard, unreadable. There was no shock in them, no pity, just a cold calculation. He was assessing her, the way a man assesses a downed tree in the middle of a trail. Lana tried to speak. She wanted to ask for help. She wanted to tell him about Josiah. But her jaw was locked, her throat parched and raw. All that came out was a faint, rattling exhale. The man didn't say a word. He didn't offer a reassuring smile or a hurried promise of safety. He simply slung his rifle across his back, leaned down, and grabbed her. His hands were huge, clad in thick leather mittens. He gripped her under the arms and hauled her up. The sudden movement sent a sickening wave of dizziness through her, and her legs buckled instantly. They were completely useless, dead weight beneath her. The man caught her before she hit the snow. With a grunt of effort, he hoisted her up, throwing her over his broad shoulder like a sack of grain. The air was knocked from her lungs. She hung upside down, staring at the deep tracks his boots had left in the snow. Then she felt the coat. He shrugged out of a massive, heavy outer layer. Wolfskin, judging by the coarse fur and the musky, wild scent. He threw it over her, wrapping it tight. The weight of it was immense, pressing down on her with a sudden, localized heat that smelled of wood smoke, old blood, and unwashed sweat. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. He didn't speak. He just turned and began to walk, carrying her into the white empty. The steady, rocking motion of his stride and the stifling darkness beneath the heavy fur finally pulled Lana under. Pain. That was the first thing. Not the cold, but an agonizing, burning, searing pain. It felt as though someone had taken a branding iron and pressed it against her fingers and toes. Lana gasped, her eyes flying open. The sound was swallowed by a dry, hacking cough that tore at her throat. "Don't move!" The voice was a low rumble, rough like two stones grinding together. She turned her head, the muscles in her neck screaming in protest. She was lying on a narrow cot in the corner of a dimly lit room. The walls were made of thick, unpeeled logs, the chinking between them packed tight with mud and moss. The air was stiflingly hot, thick with the smell of rendering fat, drying herbs, and wood smoke. A cast iron stove sat in the center of the room, radiating a fierce heat. The metal was glowing a dull, angry orange. Sitting on a three-legged stool near the stove was the man. He had shed the heavy furs. He wore a faded flannel shirt, stained dark at the cuffs, and thick canvas trousers. He was hunched over, skinning a large hare with fluid, practiced motions. His knife flashed in the firelight, separating hide from muscle with disturbing ease. Lana looked down at herself. She was still wearing her dress, though the damp wool coat she had been wearing was gone, hung on a peg near the door. She was buried under a pile of heavy wool blankets and tanned hides. "My feet," she rasped. Her voice sounded like snapping twigs. "They burn." "Blood's coming back," the man said, not looking up from the hair. "Means you get to keep 'em. You should be screaming. The quiet ones usually lose toes." He finished with the rabbit, tossing the pelt into a wooden bucket and wiping his knife on his thigh. He stood up. In the low-ceilinged cabin, he seemed even larger than he had in the snow. He walked over to a cast-iron pot resting on the top of the stove, picked up a wooden spoon, and stirred. He grabbed a tin cup, ladled some of the dark liquid into it, and walked over to her cot. "Sit up," it was a command, not a request. Lana struggled to obey. Her arms felt like they were made of wet sand. She managed to prop herself up on one elbow, her head swimming. He didn't offer a hand to help her. He just waited until she was somewhat upright, then thrust the cup toward her. "Drink, slow." Lana took it. Her hands were shaking so violently that the hot liquid sloshed over the rim, burning her knuckles. She brought it to her lips. It was broth. Venison, maybe. It tasted strongly of salt, grease, and wild onion. It was gritty, leaving a film on her tongue. She drank it greedily, gasping as the hot liquid hit her stomach. It felt like swallowing a small sun. The man watched her for a moment, then turned his back and walked to a small, rough-hewn table holding a basin of water. He began to wash his hands. "Name's Boone," he said to the wall. Lana lowered the empty cup. "Lana." He dried his hands on a rag. "Your wagon was off the main trail, 2 miles out. What were you doing up the ridge?" The memory hit her like a physical blow. The argument. Josiah insisting he knew a shortcut through the pass. Her pleading with him to stick to the wagon ruts. The sudden sickening snap of the axle. "My husband," Lana said. The word tasted vile. "He said he knew a faster way." Boone turned around. He leaned against the table, crossing his arms over his chest. "Where is he?" "He went for help." "When?" "I don't know. A day ago. 2. Boone snorted. It was a short, harsh sound. "He took the horse?" "Yes." "He took a rifle?" "Yes." Boone stared at her. The slate-gray eyes missed nothing. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't sugarcoat the reality of the situation. "He ain't coming back, Lana." He said it flatly, a statement of fact, like noting the sky was gray or the wind was blowing from the north. Tears pricked the corners of Lana's eyes, hot and sudden. She wanted to argue with him. She wanted to defend Josiah, to cling to the fragile hope that he was currently leading a rescue party up the mountain. But looking into Boone's hard, unblinking eyes, the lie died in her throat. She knew. She had known the moment Josiah had refused to look at her. Lana didn't cry. She set the tin cup down on the floorboards next to the cot. She laid back down, pulling the heavy furs up to her chin. The pain in her feet was a constant, throbbing drumbeat. "I know," she whispered to the ceiling. Boone didn't say anything else. He didn't try to comfort her. He simply turned back to the stove, picked up his knife, and began to cut the rabbit into chunks for the stew pot. The only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the fire, the steady chop of the blade against wood, and the howling of the wind outside. It was a harsh, unforgiving space, but it was warm, and she was alive. For now, that had to be enough. The blizzard did not break. For 4 days the wind battered the small cabin, a relentless shrieking assault that made the heavy logs groan. The snow piled up against the single window, blocking out the thin winter light and plunging the interior into a perpetual, smoky twilight. Inside, the space was tight, suffocatingly tight. Lana's recovery was ugly. The pain in her extremities peaked on the second day. The skin on her toes and fingertips blistered and peeled, revealing angry, raw flesh beneath. She spent hours clenching her jaw, staring at the soot-stained ceiling, riding out the waves of agony as the damaged nerves fired and misfired. Boone proved to be a man of strict routine. He woke before the fire died down to embers. He checked his rifle. He ground coffee beans with the butt of his knife. He spent hours repairing small wire snares at the table, his thick fingers moving with surprising dexterity. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was purely transactional. Eat this, move your leg, drink. He was not gentle. He did not coddle her, but he was attentive. On the third afternoon, the pain in Lana's feet had finally subsided into a dull ache. The cabin fever was beginning to set in. The walls felt like they were shrinking. She threw back the heavy hides and swung her legs over the side of the cot. Boone was at the table, running a whetstone over a large hunting knife. The metallic shh sound stopped. He looked over his shoulder. "Where do you think you're going?" "I need to walk," Lana said. Her voice was stronger now, the rasp gone. "You'll tear the skin on your soles." "I am going to walk," she repeated, her tone harder. She was tired of being helpless. She was tired of lying on her back, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Josiah. Boone watched her for a moment, then turned back to his knife. Shk, shk. Lana took a breath, placed her bare feet on the rough floorboards, and put her weight on them. The pain was immediate and sharp. Her legs, weak from disuse and the lingering shock of the cold, trembled violently. She took one step, then another. She aimed for the small washstand near the door. On the third step, her left ankle simply gave out. She pitched forward, a short cry escaping her lips. She braced herself for the harsh impact of the floorboards. It didn't come. Boone moved with a speed that defied his massive frame. He dropped the knife and caught her by the upper arm before her knees hit the ground. His grip was like an iron vise, bruising but entirely secure. For a second, they were frozen. Lana was pressed against his side, breathing hard, her face inches from his chest. She smelled wood smoke, old leather, and the sharp tang of metal. She could feel the solid, unyielding muscle of his forearm beneath the flannel of his shirt. He didn't pull her close, but he didn't let go either. He just held her weight effortlessly. "Stubborn," he muttered. "I have to move," Lana said, her voice shaking slightly, though she wasn't sure if it was from the pain or the sudden proximity. Josiah had been soft. Soft hands, soft words, a soft spine. Boone was entirely hard edges. Boone sighed, a heavy sound that stirred the air. He shifted his grip, sliding one arm around her waist and the other under her knees. He lifted her as easily as he had the day he found her in the snow. "Put me down!" Lana snapped, her pride flaring. "Shut up," Boone said evenly. He carried her not back to the cot, but to the three-legged stool near the stove. He set her down carefully. The heat from the iron immediately began to soothe the throbbing in her feet. Boone turned away and went to a small wooden chest at the foot of his own narrow bunk. He rummaged through it and pulled out a tin of greasy yellowish salve. He walked back to her, knelt on the floorboards, and took her left foot in his hand. Lana flinched, pulling her foot back. "I can do it." Boone looked up at her. The firelight cast deep shadows across his scarred face. "You can't reach him without putting weight on him. Hold still." Lana swallowed hard and forced herself to relax. Boone scooped 2 thick fingers into the tin. The salve smelled strongly of pine pitch and something medicinal, like mint or camphor. He began to rub it into the raw, peeling skin of her sole and toes. His touch was a revelation. For a man so large, so seemingly brutal, his hands were steady and precise. He didn't press too hard. He worked the salve into the damaged tissue with a rhythmic, methodical motion. Lana watched the top of his head. His hair was dark, threaded with silver, curling over the collar of his shirt. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked softly. The question had been rattling in her skull for days. Boone didn't stop rubbing the salve. "You were in my way. You could have left me. I don't like the smell of dead things on my trail." It was a harsh answer, but Lana didn't flinch. She was beginning to understand his language. He didn't deal in pleasantries. If he had meant it cruelly, he wouldn't be kneeling on the floor, greasing her battered feet. "Josiah left me," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "He said I was slowing him down. The wagon was stuck. The oxen were dead. I had a fever." She didn't know why she was telling him. Maybe it was the silence of the cabin. Maybe it was the strange intimacy of the moment. Boone switched to her right foot. "Cowards make excuses. Men make fires." Lana looked at his hands. They were heavily calloused, scarred with white lines from knives and wire and teeth. They were hands that knew how to kill, how to skin, how to survive. But right now, they were the only things tethering her to the world of the living. "He promised he'd come back," she whispered. Boone stopped. He looked up, meeting her gaze. His slate-gray eyes were intense, pinning her to the stool. "He's dead, Lana," Boone said flatly. "A man with soft hands and panic in his chest don't survive a storm like this, not on the ridge. He froze before he made it 5 miles. The blunt force of his words hit her in the chest. There was no malice in it, just the brutal truth of the mountains. Strangely, Lana didn't feel a rush of grief. She didn't cry. Instead, she felt a sudden, profound severing. The last thread tying her to the girl in the wagon, the girl who trusted a weak man, snapped. She looked at Boone, kneeling in the dirt and sawdust. She looked at the fire burning in the stove. "Good," Lana said. Her voice was cold, harder than it had ever been. Boone's hands paused. A faint, barely perceptible shift happened in his jaw. It wasn't quite a smile, but the hard lines of his face softened, just a fraction. He went back to working the salve into her skin. "Tomorrow," he grunted, "you can help me flesh the hides. If you're gonna eat my meat, you're gonna work for it." Lana leaned back slightly, feeling the heat of the stove at her back. "I wouldn't have it any other way," she said. The storm broke on the 7th day. It didn't fade gradually, it simply quit, as if the mountain had finally grown tired of screaming. In the sudden, deafening silence that followed, the crackle of the wood stove sounded like a gunshot. Boone kicked the heavy wooden door open, using his shoulder to break the 4-foot snowdrift that had sealed them in. The light that flooded the cabin was blinding, a pure, crystalline white that made Lana's eyes water. The air that rushed in was cold enough to crack teeth, but it tasted sweet. It tasted like pine and ozone. Lana stood by the stove, leaning heavily on a walking stick Boone had whittled from a length of hickory. Her feet were wrapped in thick strips of boiled wool. The blisters had popped and scabbed over. They hurt with every step, a hot, throbbing reminder of the line she had crossed, but they held her weight. "Fleshing beam is out back," Boone said. He didn't look at her. He pulled his heavy wolfskin coat over his shoulders and grabbed a long, two-handled scraping knife from the wall. "Sun's up. Fat'll soften." Lana didn't argue. She tied a heavy canvas apron over her soiled dress and followed him into the trench he had dug through the snow. The cold immediately bit into her lungs, but the physical labor kept her blood moving. The fleshing beam was a smooth, debarked log angled into the ground. Boone draped a stiff, frozen deer hide over it, the hair side down. The inside was a chaotic map of yellow fat, silver membrane, and streaks of dark, dried blood. "Push down and away," he instructed, handing her a smaller scraper made from a sharpened elk rib. "Don't angle it too sharp, or you'll cut the skin. You cut the skin, the hide is useless." He didn't demonstrate. He walked over to a stack of firewood and began splitting logs with a heavy iron maul, his back to her. Lana approached the beam. The smell was overpowering, raw, gamey, and metallic. It turned her stomach. Back in Ohio, the smell of a butcher shop had once made her faint. That memory felt like it belonged to a dead woman. She gripped the elk bone with both hands, leaned her weight into the beam, and scraped. It was grueling. The fat clung stubbornly to the hide. Her arms began to burn within minutes. Her back ached, a deep, grinding pain in her lumbar spine. The elk bone slipped, barking her knuckles against the frozen log. She cursed, a short, sharp word she had never used in her life, and sucked the blood from her bruised hand. She looked over at Boone. He hadn't paused his rhythm. Thwack. The maul bit into the wood. The log split perfectly down the grain. Lana gripped the scraper again. She adjusted her angle, pushed. A long strip of yellow fat curled away, exposing the clean white leather beneath. She worked for 3 hours. The sun climbed higher, reflecting off the snowdrifts and burning her cheeks. Sweat pooled between her shoulder blades, chilling instantly in the freezing air whenever the wind kicked up. Her hands cramped, the fingers locking around the bone tool, but she didn't stop. She stripped the hide clean, inch by agonizing inch, until the entire surface was a uniform, pale canvas. When she finally stepped back, her arms trembling so violently she dropped the scraper, Boone was standing beside her. He held a tin cup of steaming black coffee. He looked at the hide. He ran a bare, calloused hand over the surface, feeling for nicks or leftover grease. He found none. "It'll tan," he grunted. He handed her the coffee. Lana took it with shaking hands. "Thank you. Don't thank me for work you did yourself." They stood in the blinding snow, drinking the bitter, scalding coffee in silence. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers. It was the heavy, settled silence of two animals sharing the same watering hole. Over the next 3 weeks, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. It ceased to be a place of rescue and became a place of industry. Lana learned the brutal economy of survival. Nothing was wasted. She learned to crack marrow bones and render the fat. She learned to mend Boone's heavy canvas trousers with a bone needle and sinew, her stitches crooked at first, then tight and even. She learned to clean his heavy sharps rifle. The smell of gun oil and sulfur becoming a permanent fixture on her hands. Boone left every morning to check his trap lines, often returning well after dark. He would drop skinned carcasses, marten, fox, sometimes a small bobcat, onto the frozen ground outside the door. Lana would have the water boiling and the fleshing beam cleared. He never asked about her past. She never asked about his. There was a physical proximity between them that crackled with an unspoken tension, but Boone never crossed the line. He was a man of strict boundaries. When they sat by the stove at night, he whittling or repairing gear, she mending or stretching hides, they might as well have been alone in the room. Yet, Lana found herself watching him. She watched the way the muscles in his jaw worked when he was thinking. She watched the fluid, predatory grace of his movements, a stark contrast to his massive size. Josiah had been a man of words, constantly talking, constantly planning, his voice filling every quiet space until it became white noise. Boone was a man of action. His silence was a physical weight. One evening, Boone returned late. The wind had picked up again, howling through the pines. He kicked the door shut, barring it, and shrugged off his coat. He was covered in a fine layer of snow, his beard completely frozen. He didn't bring any game. Instead, he walked to the table and set down a small, heavy object. It landed with a dull thud. Lana looked up from the wool sock she was darning. It was a silver pocket watch. The casing was heavily dented, the glass face shattered. The chain was broken, caked in dried mud and something dark and rust-colored. Lana stared at it. She recognized the intricate engraving on the back. It was a weeping willow. It had belonged to Josiah's grandfather. The cabin was dead silent, save for the crackling fire. "Found the wagon," Boone said. His voice was lower than usual, gravelly and flat. "Spring thaw is starting lower down the mountain. Snow collapsed over the ridge." Lana slowly set the sock down. She stood up. Her legs didn't shake. Her chest didn't heave. She walked to the table and looked down at the ruined watch. "Where?" she asked. 2 miles from where I found you, bottom of a ravine. Looks like he tried to ride the gelding down the steep side. Horse lost its footing." Boone paused. He watched her face intently, searching for the break. "Didn't look like he suffered long. Neck broke on the fall." Lana picked up the watch. The metal was freezing cold. It felt heavy in her palm, an anchor to a world she no longer recognized. She had spent the first week in the cabin praying for Josiah to come back. She had spent the next 2 weeks hating him for leaving. Now, holding the only piece of him left, she felt absolutely nothing. The well was dry. "He was always a terrible rider," Lana said. Her voice was steady. It surprised even her. She walked over to the stove. She opened the heavy iron door, feeling the blistering heat rush over her face. She looked at the watch one last time, then tossed it into the glowing red coals. Boone didn't move. He stood by the table, his slate-gray eyes locked onto her. The firelight cast harsh shadows across his scarred face. Lana shut the iron door with a solid clank. She turned to face him. "Did you salvage any of the flour from the wagon?" she asked. A long moment passed. The muscle in Boone's jaw twitched. Then he let out a low breath. "Flour's ruined. Got a sack of beans, though." "Then I'll put them on to soak," Lana said. She walked back to her stool and picked up the needle and the torn sock. Boone watched her for a few seconds longer, a profound, unspoken understanding passing between them in the smoky air. The weak girl who had waited to die in the snow was gone. The mountain had killed her. He unbuckled his gun belt and hung it on the wall. "Make 'em with the salt pork," Boone said. Spring arrived not with a gentle bloom, but with a violent reckoning. The snowpack, which had held the mountains in a silent chokehold for months, began to rot. The air lost its sharp, metallic bite and turned heavy, smelling of wet earth, decomposing pine needles, and mud. The creek behind the cabin, previously a frozen ribbon, roared to life, churning brown and violent as it carried the runoff down into the valley. The physical toll of the winter began to lift. Lana's feet had fully healed, leaving behind thick, callus-ridged scars. She moved around the cabin and the surrounding woods with a new, sure-footed strength. The softness of the Ohio farm girl had been entirely burned away, replaced by lean muscle and a quiet, watchful demeanor. She wore a buckskin tunic now, stitched herself from the hides she had scraped, layered over her ruined wool dress. Her hair, once neatly pinned, was braided tight against her scalp. She looked like the wilderness. She felt like it too. With the thaw came the realization of the calendar. It was late April. The lower passes would be clearing. One morning, Boone sat on the chopping block outside, meticulously running a whetstone over his hunting knife. The rhythmic shh sound echoed off the dripping pines. Lana was carrying a wooden bucket of water up from the creek. The muddy banks were treacherous, but she navigated them easily. She set the bucket down near the door and wiped her brow with the back of her forearm. Boone stopped sharpening. He didn't look up, his thumb testing the blade's edge. "Stage company will be running wagons through the valley by the end of the week," he said. Lana froze. The water in the bucket rippled, catching the bright spring sunlight. Boone finally looked at her. His eyes were unreadable, walled off behind a fortress of deep lines and weathered skin. "They set up a way station 20 miles south of here. Trading post. You can get a ride to the fort. From there, you can catch a train back east. Back to your people." Lana stared at him. Her heart executed a slow, heavy thump against her ribs. He was offering her an out. He was handing her the ticket back to civilization, back to a world of painted houses, soft beds, and predictable days. It was what any civilized man would do. But Boone wasn't civilized, and neither was she, not anymore. "My people are dead," Lana said. "You got a sister in Pennsylvania. You mentioned her when the fever was high." "She's a stranger," Lana countered, her voice hardening. "She doesn't know who I am." "And who are you?" Boone stood up. He sheathed the knife in one fluid motion. He closed the distance between them, his heavy boots sinking slightly into the spring mud. He stopped just 2 feet away. He was massive, blocking out the sun, smelling of sweat and pine pitch, and the raw, earthy scent of the thaw. "You're a widow," Boone said, his voice dropping to that low, gravelly rumble. "You survived the winter. You proved your point. You don't belong out here, not long term. This mountain eats people, Lana. It just hasn't gotten around to swallowing you yet." Lana didn't back up. She tilted her chin up, meeting his stare head on. She remembered the girl crying against the wagon wheel, waiting for a man to save her. That girl made her sick. "The mountain didn't save me," Lana said softly. Her eyes locked on his. "You did," Boone's jaw tightened. "I just picked you up. You did the surviving." Then let me survive. She stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest. Beneath the rough flannel of his shirt, she could feel the heavy, steady thud of his heart. It matched the rhythm of her own. I know what's down in that valley, Lana said, her voice fiercely steady. I know what towns are like. They are full of soft men with loud voices who break at the first sign of winter. I married one. I won't go back to that. Boone looked down at her hand against his chest. He slowly reached up, his large, calloused hand wrapping around hers. He didn't push it away. He held it there. His grip was strong, rough, and entirely grounding. It's a hard life up here, he warned, his voice tight, as if the words were being dragged out of him. It's cold, it's bloody. We don't talk much. And if you break your leg on the ridge, I might have to shoot you. A genuine smile, the first one she had felt in 6 months, cracked the hard lines of Lana's face. It didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were as slate-hard as his, but it was real. If I break my leg on the ridge, Lana replied, her grip tightening on his hand, I expect you to hand me the rifle so I can do it myself. Boone stared at her for a long, silent moment. The wind rustled the branches of the pines, shaking loose the last drops of melted snow. The creek roared in the background. The tension that had been humming between them all winter finally snapped. Boone's hand slid from hers, wrapping around the back of her neck. His fingers tangled in the stray hairs that had escaped her braid. He pulled her forward, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed in deeply, taking in the scent of wood smoke, lye soap, and the wild, untamed essence she had become. He didn't kiss her. It wasn't that kind of romance. It was a claim. It was an acknowledgement of an equal. Lana wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his heavy chest. She closed her eyes. She wasn't waiting for the end anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Boone pulled back, his large hands resting on her shoulders. He looked toward the cabin door. Take the water inside, he grunted, the rough edge back in his voice. I saw fresh elk tracks by the eastern ridge. We need meat if we're putting up stores for next winter. Lana bent down and picked up the heavy wooden bucket. It didn't feel heavy at all. I'll sharpen the fleshing knives, she said. She turned and walked into the cabin, leaving the door wide open to the spring air. If Lana and Boone's journey through the brutal winter and their gritty fight for survival struck a chord with you, don't leave them out in the cold. Hit that like button to let us know you want more grounded stories. Share this video with someone who appreciates a raw Western tale, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next audio drama. Drop a comment below. Would you have stayed on the mountain? Thanks for listening.